Life in the Middle Ages was brutal and squalid. To be a soldier was even worse than you could possibly imagine. Soldiers of that era faced the constant danger of being wounded by a sword, an axe, or something much heavier, and such injuries were often gravely life-threatening. Then, if you didn't perish instantly, you risked being captured. If no one paid your ransom, you could consider yourself already dead. Polished Hollywood movies that depict honor and glory, like Braveheart, because the soldier's life was truly awful. So let's find out what it was like to be a medieval soldier. Nowadays, joining the army is often a personal choice. While serving in the army, they receive physical and combat training. However, for soldiers hundreds of years ago, in the Middle Ages, such combat training and skill development was extremely rare, if it existed at all. In fact, Crusader armies marching from Europe to the Holy Land were often motley groups of peasants and farmers who perhaps didn't even have a military leader to guide them. Most soldiers in the Middle Ages already possessed the necessary skills before being called into the army. Through hunting, they learned to use weapons and ride horses. Siege warfare was one of the most effective methods to secure victory in the medieval era. The army surrounds a city, village, or castle, cutting off external food access for weeks or even months. They would bombard the city, and once the defending forces were weakened by a lack of provisions and a decline in morale, they would then commence their assault on the castle. The primary objective of the siege was not to utterly destroy everything, although that was frequently the outcome. Its true purpose was to demoralize and intimidate the populace into complete submission. After they surrendered, the invading army could take them as slaves and plunder the castle. If you survived the battle but were wounded, you will not survive for very much longer. Those individuals who did not perish in the heat of battle but were wounded instead likely passed away shortly thereafter. Without the benefit of modern medical assistance, their open wounds would continue to bleed throughout the following days and weeks. Or could they even have discovered that their wounds were festering from serious infections? They were often left to die on the battlefield because the chances of survival were very low and the risk of spreading disease was high. Soldiers who returned home after being wounded usually bore scars that were visible for the rest of their lives. Battle scars became a symbol of great prestige, as those who survived their grievous wounds certainly earned the right to boast about them. Soldiers who were summoned to travel across very long distances for their battles frequently took along their wives, their children, and various other members of their families. It was a very common occurrence for the entire family to depart, particularly during the era of the Crusades. Of course, this practice meant that every single person faced the many hardships of war, and not only the soldiers who were fighting. Sometimes elderly individuals and children would embark on lengthy, arduous, and hazardous journeys to the battlefield. From the time of the Roman Empire's collapse, extending through the entire medieval period, there were very few permanent armies whose soldiers engaged in combat throughout the entire year. Many of these soldiers were primarily farmers and peasants, especially the infantry. They had to fulfill their duties in the fields, otherwise they and everyone else in the village would surely starve to death. Thus, there were certain seasons when lords and kings summoned their men to join battle or engage in any other military campaign. The campaign season typically took place between planting and harvest, often during the summer months. Soldiers preferred not to fight during the cold winter months, but sieges often lasted weeks and extended well into winter. These sieges were especially destructive and devastating since they frequently prohibited the local people from gathering their harvests and consequently resulted in widespread mass starvation both within the walls of the besieged city because of the blockade and among the families of the soldiers because there was no one left to bring in the crops. However, if you managed to successfully capture the city, then you would be free to seize whatever you desired, as that was considered to be your rightful pay. Today, soldiers receive a salary as well as benefits. Looting or any exploitation of the population they are fighting against is strictly forbidden and can be prosecuted as a war crime. However, in the Middle Ages, things were different. There was no pay for soldiers. If they emerged victorious, they were expected to loot their enemies to pay for the services they had provided. Those soldiers who fought on the winning side and managed to survive the heat of the battle would plunder the fallen and seize their weapons, their armor, and especially gold or anything else that was considered to be of great value to them. Sometimes they would plunder the surrounding city or village for both provisions and sustenance, as well as for mere spoils in the form of precious items. Later, in the Middle Ages, the system shifted slightly as military leaders began distributing spoils equally among soldiers as payment for their service. You could earn money in war if, of course, you stayed alive, but before that, you had to spend because you buy your own food and equipment. modern armies provide their soldiers with uniforms, food, weapons, and other necessities. Greek, Persian, and Roman armies, along with many other ancient military forces, supplied their soldiers with uniforms to more easily identify who the enemy was. In the Middle Ages, the only standing army was the Templars. Armies were conscripted from farmers who were forced to abandon their agricultural lands. Consequently, the leaders possessed no resources, neither the time nor the patience, to properly outfit their soldiers in uniforms. They didn't even provide them with food or weapons. All these provisions were the sole responsibility of the soldiers themselves. If you survived and made it back home, you likely carried diseases with you. Perhaps the single most perilous aspect of medieval warfare was the constant threat of illness. People were already aware of biological warfare and frequently employed it, utilizing devices such as catapults to hurl the cadavers of both humans and animals over the castle walls. They might even find a way to smuggle a sick person deep behind enemy lines in order to infect the entire opposing army. There was a harsh reality that the wounds which a soldier might receive became a fertile breeding ground for various microbes, and the individual then transported them all the way back to their very own home. Many Crusader soldiers, upon their return from Jerusalem, carried with them the various diseases they had contracted. Even if they didn't succumb to these illnesses, they could still transmit them, thereby infecting communities along their entire journey back home. Combine these realities with the fact that medieval hygiene was truly terrible, and raw sewage often ran through the city streets, and you have the ideal breeding ground for widespread, large-scale infections. People likely possessed some level of immunity to the diseases that were common in their local areas. But when soldiers returned from distant lands and brought back new diseases, they were completely helpless. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, write your topics in the comments,